talk you through what we are trying to do here and what we've learned so far. And then we'll have some specific questions that we want your feedback on. But let me just take 5 minutes or so to kind of run through what we're trying to do here. And so the idea is, again, Sven is a member of Parliament in Luxembourg, and he's a member of OpenAir. And for the last several months, we've been thinking through what can he do legislatively in Luxembourg that could not only put good policy into place there, but potentially inspire similar types of policies in other parts of Europe and beyond. And so the intention here is to, hey, Eli, how are you? Just getting started.
Hey, Chris. Thrilled to be here. Sorry I'm late, everyone.
No worries. Literally just starting. So just giving a little bit of background here. So again, the idea, this isn't sort of an academic exercise or something that we hope will result in a paper. The only paper we want this to result in is an actual legislation that Sven wants to introduce in Luxembourg in the beginning of January, if we get to a point where we feel like the policy is solid and developed enough. And the idea, as we're doing right now in the United States with our carbon procurement bill, which is getting introduced in New York, and then we have active conversations in 5 other states, we want to go viral. We want to spread policies in real time in different parts of the country and world. And that's definitely the goal here with the Carbon Fit project. What we're doing here, what you're participating in right now, is what we call a collective intelligence relay. So in order for us to get really good policy, we're having a series each week of small roundtables for an hour with different experts to give us their input on different aspects of the policy as it evolves. So each week we incorporate new stuff in that we then bring to the subsequent group. So this is the third and was going to be the final. I think we are going to add another one. And then what we're going to do is post the recording of this on YouTube, and then within our community, try to get more input from different types of people on what was said. And we use a platform for that called Your Priorities, which allows people to easily enter information. So the concept, I did send around a brief, no problem if you didn't see it. I just figured I would supply that in advance if anybody wanted to read it. But the idea behind this, there's a couple of key principles that really come from Sven, myself, that we want to achieve here policy-wide. This is a demand and investment stimulation idea. And the key thing that's very important for practical, political, and philosophical reasons for Sven, which I fully subscribe to, is can we have a policy that democratizes or decentralizes investment and ownership opportunities? So we don't develop something that can only be captured by large actors. That's very important for Sven. Through this policy, can we create a kind of a pull incentive for distributed modular forms of direct air capture, while not excluding larger forms as well, but sort of consistent with that first principle? Sven is really interested in a policy that can maybe help create a market for more distributed modular forms. We want a policy that is broad enough and flexible enough right now that as technological and economic circumstances change inevitably over time, that we haven't painted ourselves into a corner and something that will break and have to get scrapped, something that can be adjusted over time to meet change. And then the last part, which is really important, just to make clear, we're doing a CDR policy, and a lot of the motivation for that is to pull carbon out of the air, obviously, and to comply with quality standards to make sure it's high quality CDR. But Sven has made it explicitly clear that he wants the market transformation goal to be front and center here too. That part of the story here is that he wants Luxembourg and whoever follows along to be part of the story of driving down the cost of direct air capture. So that has implications for how we would design the policy. And the inspiration, that's the word that Sven is always at pains to stress. If this winds up becoming something that's very different from the feed-in-tariff, that's fine. But that was our sort of starting reference point. We liked certain aspects of the renewable energy feed-in-tariff, which obviously played a huge role in ramping up demand for solar and driving down costs, as well as wind. And there's certain aspects of the FIT policy that we think could be adapted and modeled for what we're trying to do here. One is just to open up and create an opportunity for people to be able to sell their carbon, just like with FIT, you had access to the grid and you could sell your renewable energy. Offering premium prices or tariff for those services rendered that match the actual investment costs that ensure that there's going to be an attractive return for investors. Differentiate the tariffs by technology and project type rather than just a generic single tariff. Long-term contracts. This is something, Klaus, we want to talk to you about. How long should they be? We want it to be long enough to create certainty for investors, but not so long that it crowds out innovation. And then have an annual digression rate that every new participant each year will have access to a somewhat lower tariff, both reflecting real price changes, but also sort of forcing the market towards lower cost. And then having a system that's paid for, that's critically important. The feed-in tariff attached fees to electricity bills. So ratepayers ultimately paid for these premiums. So we think that these pieces in different shapes and form can be borrowed for and adapted for something like a carbon dioxide removal feed-in tariff. But obviously there's huge differences between electricity and carbon removal that we have to contend with in policy design. One is when the German feed-in tariff in the early 2000s came into force, there was already solar and wind. They were expensive, but they were already well established. There was already an electricity grid. So there was some elements there that could be leveraged. Obviously with carbon removal, we're at a very early stage, really just had the sort of first real commercial project launched just a couple of months ago in Iceland. So those are really critical differences that we have to think about. The other part that we've really discovered through talking about this is that where is the value generated? What are we sort of valuing here and paying people for? With a feed-in tariff, the feed-in part, it's electrons going onto the grid. That's when the value is generated, and that's what you're paid for. When we use that term with carbon, it sort of gives the sense that we're talking about a similar thing. It's about feeding your carbon into some type of infrastructure and then it goes somewhere. That's not what we're really actually looking at, particularly not right now. So we've already started to think about, are there alternative terms that sort of get at what we're trying to do, where you're like a drawdown tariff, for instance, where you're generating the value from removing carbon dioxide, and you open it up where you're awarding both removals and also circular applications from the beginning. And again, this is in line with the market transformation goals, is awarding applications even if it's not a removal. The other part, again, that I want to start off with right now with our first question, I'm dying to get your thoughts on, is we're really interested in this idea, obviously, of democratization and decentralization of investment and ownership, but that is limited, obviously, by what the technology is capable of doing. What are we looking at in terms of our options? And if the technology is not there or will not be there soon enough, then we'll have to look at, sort of modifying this expectation. The renewable energy fit, the technologies at hand, even wind, but certainly solar, were already inherently modular. So it allowed for this sort of democratization where a rooftop system could participate just like a utility scaled system. So that is a question I want to start with the three of you is, we started with our first one. We had Eric Dahlgreen, who obviously, Klaus, well from Arcella, and some other distributed modular DAC startups sort of help us talk through this. But I want to sort of start with your thoughts on our expectations around the modularity of DAC, how DAC can be utilized on site, both for commercial, industrial, and potentially even residential purposes. So let's just start with that basic question. And Klaus, this is obviously your bread and butter, and I didn't know if you wanted to sort of start us off with your thoughts or comments on that.
Well, you can look at Climeworks machines, right? They are inherently modular. I don't think there is a fundamental rule which says these things want to get big. As a matter of fact, if you make them very big in single units, you run into problems you don't have anywhere smaller. So I don't see the big advantage of being large here there's not much to be gained. So I do think that air capture devices could inherently be small, and you get to scale by numbering up rather than by scaling up, which is not to say that, for example, in disposal of carbon dioxide, in sequestration of carbon dioxide, you may not end up with a back end which wants a lot of CO2 in one place. Right. So on the other hand, if you were to build devices like this and fill entire fields with it, you can get to very large numbers, and you can't get to very much larger numbers with a big system either, because ultimately, if you have a very big system, the wind has to bring you fresh air, otherwise you're sucking in your own old exhaust and try to take the CO2 out over and over again. So that doesn't work. So at some point, the rate at which the air replenishes itself sets a limit how far big you can get. And I do think this is inherently a small technology, and I see fundamental advances. And this is what Eric was pointing out too, because he wrote a PhD thesis on this project, and I was one of his advisors. Ultimately, mass production, factory-built systems which are installed have fundamental advantages. And my analogy sometimes is the car engine. The car engine is about 100 times cheaper kilowatt for kilowatt than a power plant. And that is the mass production paradigm which got it there. And the other thing is they can be deployed where you want to, right? And yes, you could aggregate a lot of them to very much power. As a matter of fact, the US production of car engines in 1 year creates a power capacity which is larger than the entire power plant fleet. So mass production, small units doesn't mean small potatoes. You can you can have very, very large systems built out of very, very small things which are inherently mass produced. And in my view, that's where the cost reduction comes from. It's the number of generations you can put in which drives costs down, and therefore that's important.
I agree with that. And Sven, I want to, in 30 seconds, and I would love to get Louis and Eli's feedback on this too, as well as yours, Klaus. When you were visualizing this or thinking about it at a high level around distributed, even residential types of systems, can you fill in a little bit about your sort of rationale for that, or what you were looking at in 30 seconds, why that's important to you?
I think, first of all, it's a question about accessibility. We can't have anything that is inherently limited to only big players. If we are limiting everything to big players, we will have the same Total and BP and Q8 again that we had over the past decades, almost a century. So democratizing access to CO2 removal is, for me, the same importance than democratizing access to solar energy. And that's why I really believe in modular solutions.
Gotcha. And I think what we found out in our review of a historian of the German Feed-in-Tariff is the political survivability of the Feed-in-Tariff was very much tied into the ability of many different types of people to get value from it rather than big players. But obviously there's challenges when we're talking about this. You could envision an air cella type of project that generates fuel on site. But what are there other, if we could think like futurists for a second, what are the other things over the next 5 years where we could really imagine distributed DAC creating value either as a circular application or as a removal? I don't know if you think, I'm sure you think about that all the time, Klaus, but you know, what will distributed DAC look like maybe in 5 years beyond what AirCell is trying to do?
Well, fuel is an obvious one, right? You could make ultimately other materials. Many of the applications just help you because you avoid using fossil carbon instead. But I do see that many of the sequestration options are inherently large scale. But here too, and I don't think people have worked very hard on it, if you end up putting carbon away, well then yeah, you could do that locally. But then you spend a lot of energy on making the carbon energetic gain, and I'm not sure that's where things end up. So I see many of the storage options inherently have a larger end behind them. And one of the advantages of air capture is that it transports things to the place. The air transports the CO2 where you want it. So the last thing you want is to have a removal logistics, which starts at every house. That's challenging. On the other hand, if you can use the stuff for whatever it is, you displaced fossil carbon, so you get into the circular part. I think that's the larger part. The other part though is if it is small, I think of farming as modular too, but I don't grow most of my food in my backyard, right? So you can have companies which are a lot smaller than the oil companies producing CO2 at a site. And if you do geological sequestration, you could do it one well at a time. As a matter of fact, if your air capture units are mobile, that opens, because you can pick them up on a truck and move them 10 miles. You are in a place where you can actually follow wells. And many wells which we drill nowadays for all sorts of reasons, including natural gas, but I suspect for CO2 too, could be of the type where after 2 years, the well doesn't accept anything. And saying, okay, now that 20 tons a day, which were pumped down this hole, is now moving 5 miles. The other point I would make about the fossil fuel industry, the big players, the BPs and the Shells and the Exxons, they may, and I've talked with a lot of them, they may intellectually understand that there's a problem they need to solve, but inherently in their culture, they're going to drag their feet, because from their perspective, this is a nuisance we have to deal with rather than a business opportunity to do something new. And one of the things I really truly like about the Climeworks effort in Iceland, it works without having the oil companies involved. Every player there likes doing what they are doing because it's worthwhile and they would like to see more of it. Whereas every oil company will say, well, if I have to do it, I will, but I wish we would have to do less of it. And that change in the attitude about it is actually incredibly, incredibly important. And there you actually have an example where it's not all that large, and you can see modular systems come in, and that also allows you to have investors which come in at a relatively small scale. Yeah. Right? You don't build $1 billion project for every thing you pull off the ground.
Yeah. You could see something like a community solar version for direct air capture, where you have a lot of small investors are subscribing to a system and they're getting paid for by a feed-in tariff type of model. Eli, you and I talked briefly about this, and just the idea of small versus big. And I think you're like me, that we think all of the above. But just to wrap up this subject, and Lewis too, you know, I'm excited about Climeworks, not only its Orca project, but I know there's plans in the near future to be selling individual units to project developers, which implies some sense that modularity is going to be part of the future of the business. But I don't know if Eli and Lewis, if you have anything just to add to this question of how realistic modularity is, and how much we should assume it'll be a possibility for this policy.
Sure, I'll leave the technical side to Lewis, but I just had a few ideas that were coming up as Klaus was speaking. And I think on the one hand, the analogy about, you know, many DAC units sort of depriving each other of CO2 concentrations, taking it to the other end, you might want to go where CO2 concentrations are highest. And I know there's a lot of companies that are focusing on the sort of HVAC idea, cleaning up high carbon content in office buildings. So there's kind of that pull. But generally, I agree with Klaus that, you know, once you're collecting CO2 in many small spaces, you have to build an infrastructure. And the best analogy for that is the household waste collection infrastructure, which is, you know, and I think there's a company called Remora, which is valiantly trying to do non-stationary CO2 capture from moving trucks. And they're dealing with this issue of how do they efficiently consolidate all that CO2 into holding tanks and then get the holding tank CO2 transported to a well that Occidental Petroleum controls. It's very complex. And so I do think that there are some fundamental limits there. And so when we think about Sven's prompt that we think about democratizing, I think we can look at democratizing supply, but we can also be democratizing demand, which is the point you just made, Chris, about the analogies with community solar or the kind of smart grid prosumer model, where the buyers of the DAC are themselves distributed and diffuse. And that, you know, allows, so that's the great thing about this, is the product that we're selling after we've dealt with the physical movement of the CO2 is completely digital. And so we can democratize and decentralize it to the nth degree. The other thing I would bring in, the final thing I would bring in, is that I think, you know, it's great to talk about distributed DAC and distributed DACs, because we do need to always be careful about, are we talking about carbon utilization, as Klaus was saying, to make products, and et cetera, or are we talking about carbon removal, where there's actually storage at the end? We need to do both. But it's not just distributed DAC or DACs, it's distributed CDR. And I think it would be interesting to think through, you know, I wouldn't have the expertise to do this, but to think about bikers, that's the acronym biomass, carbon removal, and storage, bikers opportunities that are decentralized, and think about all the tiny pockets of biogenic CO2, people's yard waste, people's, like, you know, breweries and fermentation units. That's another potential supply of CO2 that if captured, bottled up, and stored would constitute removal. So I'm really excited to explore this, even if it's just about distributed DACs, but I think we can also expand it to distributed bikers and think about a whole nother set of options.
Yeah, I think on that point, and Sven will back me up on it, is that DACs we're using, we have an interest in that, but I think that the threshold is really measurability. We want something that is meterable and verifiable. And so, but when you're talking about distributed BECs, there you are, you meet that same criteria. So I think assume that we're talking about technologies that can be seen and measured and valued somewhat in real time, rather than over the course of averages, like a lot of natural.
And I would come back to the logistics issue. Don't underestimate that. I realized one day in New York, it costs about $80 a ton of garbage to get it out of the city. And that, from our perspective, is a large fraction of the cost we have available. So I actually think if you're truly distributed in your collection, and meaning that each site is small, it is very powerful to tie that to renewable energy and then ship things out as a valuable liquid like methanol or something like that. And so I could see that getting highly distributed and then feed into the system from that end. If you have one gripe right now with how this whole thing is moving, not on DAC, but on climate change, we are trying very hard to kill supply of fossil fuels and leave demand alone. We need to turn this around. We need to kill demand and not supply, because otherwise costs go up because demand is still there. Everybody gets mad, and the big oil countries are lining their pockets because they can get $100 a barrel because they're the only ones playing. So we got to figure out to say, look, we have fuel. We don't need you. We don't need you guys to make fuel for us. And so we need to stop demand. And this really could do that. And this is where the Acela story basically came from. Yeah. Right? And we all can be in that boat. And then, of course, in order to solve the carbon problem, we will have to sequester an awful lot amount of carbon. And we can do that too. And on that end, I think the biggest thing we can do for democratization is to create an honest and carefully designed, properly accounted certificate of sequestration. And I would argue that if you dig carbon up out of the ground, you have to purchase a certificate of sequestration and punch it used. And then anybody who actually honestly puts carbon away safely and permanently can issue such a certificate, or is handed such a certificate, which then can be sold to those who need it. And negative emissions then happen by punching one of those tickets as used, even though there was no fossil carbon coming out of the ground. And the challenge is to make that credible, because we have messed up this market with fly-by-night offsets, which are not very good. And so again, I like what Climeworks does in Iceland, because that carbon is definitely put away and it's safely and permanently put away. I would give you a certificate of permanent sequestration, no question asked. Right? On the other hand, if you store it for 5 years, you better take on the liability that at the end of the 5 years, you store it again. And again, you need direct air capture or negative carbon removal technologies to generate that second certificate, because the first one you may have gotten from a point source. The second time around, you lost it. And so therefore, it definitely is in the environment, and you have to get it back. So all of these CDR technologies will play a very big role, and we will outgrow what biomass can do in short order. So these direct air capture technologies become very big.
And Eli, let's, in a couple of minutes, when we're talking about the funding part of this, I'd like to return to the certificate of sequestration and the carbon take-back obligation and see what we're thinking about, how that could be strengthened or justified with what you just described and a carbon take-back obligation view of things. But One thing that we could just get into, which I'm really interested in getting your thoughts on, all of you. And sorry, Louis, before I do that, Louis, if you had anything to add to anything that's been said before, please go for it.
No, all good. I think I'm also appreciative of the view that we have to democratize demand rather than supply. I think that is one of the key issues. Given logistics, even if you sequester carbon like we do in Iceland, then it sounds simple in media articles and the like, but it's hard to get the permit to actually inject CO2. And to restart this process overall every 2 years, for example, if the reservoir isn't big enough to store more, and you'd have to adapt every single year, it's just involving a lot of slack. From governmental issues, you'd still have to monitor wells after you have abandoned them to a certain amount of time. So this just adds a lot of complexity to the issue of having this distributed and modularly produced is good, but I think modularly deployed is a tough thing to do, and that would be just the emphasis that I want to echo here.
Great. Well, just on the part about how we would do a tariff, obviously with renewable energy, you had a prescriptive model where there was particular technologies, and based on the technology and the scale of deployment, they were assigned a tariff that was corresponded to the cost of installation and the investment cost. Now, with a carbon feed-in tariff, you could envision something similar to that, where it would change over time, where the state would basically qualify certain type of applications that they deemed to be market ready, right? So it might be fuel production at the industrial or even residential scale, could be one of those that gets a tariff. You could have certain applications like DAC integrated with carbon utilization for concrete. There's 10 ready mix plants within Luxembourg. And then over time, as other types of solutions and applications become ready, the state could either retire ones or add new ones. So that would be a prescriptive type of model. The other one could be something that's more performance-based and similar to like what we call in electricity, a value-based or value stack-based model. And here you might have a range of different factors for which you would get different values that are not, some are mutually exclusive, but some could stack on top of each other. So you might have a circular application gets 20 euros, where a removal gets 50. You have a solution that's 100-year permanence gets a lower amount than something that's deemed to be 1,000. Local versus external projects, a technology that maybe has a very high upside that we want in terms of the overall carbon that it can remove, would maybe get a higher carbon to sort of reflect the need to scale that up sooner. So that's another way of doing it. And I wonder, just between those two, if you guys have some thoughts on what a tariff might look like to be effective for carbon removal.
Nobody says something, let me be a radical.
Go for it.
I think what's missing right now is affordable air capture. And so in an extreme version, I'd be perfectly happy to say, I don't care what happens to the carbon for the first 1 million tons, it doesn't matter, because that's the drop in the bucket, no matter how you look at it. What we are really after is to get the cost of direct air capture down. And so if you can demonstrate that you can produce CO2 product for whatever reason, and I don't care whether it was a Coca-Cola plant, I burp it out tomorrow, right? The goal of the exercise was to say we are now well below $100, and now we can have policies which demand that we actually put the CO2 away, because I think the storage side of the story is way ahead of the capture side of the story, in spite of the difficulties Louis pointed out of getting things certified, but I think they are ahead. So my view is, at some extreme version, the fact that you captured is something worth rewarding. Now, eventually you have to move beyond that and say this was only to get you below $100 a ton or 100 euros a ton. Once you are there, then we put up regulations and say you actually do need to put CO2 away. But that's an extreme version of the story. The other options is to say it's just let's figure out how to make it big enough that it drives the cost down, and you can insist that that either makes fuel and therefore gets you into the circular situation, or you really have to displace fossil. If you don't, then it doesn't count. That's sort of the other extreme. And on the other side, you could store, which is not all that different than what the low carbon fuel standard in California is doing.
Yeah, we've considered that as a reference point as well. Sven, just real quick, I mean, I think one of the things that we agreed on early on is that we understand the necessity over the next 10 years is driving the cost down. So there's not a problem, I think, with what you just said. But Sven, do you agree, and just in terms of political sellability, that you could look at, the initial phase, the emphasis is on getting CDR out, DAC out by any means necessary to drive the cost down?
I strongly believe that we need to get DAC out to remove carbon from the air. And it's a bit like with solar. The initial deployments were not the best ones. It was certainly not the most efficient ones. It was certainly not the cheapest one. But by getting it out, we drove down costs. We rewarded innovation, and that certainly would create that virtuous circle to get costs down and get more deployments, and thus get all the things we want at the phase 2, phase 3. But initially, we need to get the ball moving at whatever it takes.
Great. And Eli and Lewis, if you have anything to add on this idea of how would you constitute a tariff? What's the most effective way to drive adoption and investment?
I was going to just expand on Klaus's point a little bit and say that that I really appreciate the Puro's model and also the UK Committee on Climate Change's model for defining carbon removal as 3 stages. There's the instance of extraction from air, the transport or fixing of the carbon into a usable form, and the storage. And those are 3 separate modules. And there is a total value for the full chain use of all 3 of those modules in succession, but each of those modules should have value in and of itself. And so I was encouraged to learn one of the main tech companies that is buying carbon removal, early stage CDR, is starting to adopt this model and to say, actually, it's okay if you're just capturing the carbon and just re-emitting it. If it's just practicing the step of extraction and getting repetitions in on that has value in and of itself. So I am in agreement there. I just think we should be really clear about the 3 stages of carbon removal, and we should potentially have a way to reward them separately.
You can see that, Eli, as a stack, right? You could have, if you get all 3 of those, then that's when you get up to, you get it's valued. But if you have the one of them, that's okay. You're just not getting it as much. So that could be the basis of a stack.
And I think that, to Klaus's point about if someone is able to make a product in their backyard or at an industrial facility and lock that carbon in, provided it's additional, right? Because there's going to be a lot of situations where we've seen Puro selling structural timber CDR, where it's, the financial additionality to me is not clear because the timber company was harvesting trees and making timber long before Puro came along and said, we'll offer you $30 a ton to do that. But if you are making a product and it is in that case an avoided emission, then I think there's a strong argument to say, well, you've avoided 1 ton of CO2, and that is comparable to reducing emissions in the EU ETS by 1 ton, albeit outside of the EU ETS cap. So that might be an argument to tie that price to the EUA price, which is like 60 euros now, and say that you get more for the other thing. But the only thing I was gonna introduce was just to say, is it worth working backwards from and you've probably already talked about this in the previous 2 meetings at length, but what can we just paint a picture of what we're actually envisioning actually will happen? I mean, to Klaus's point that what we really need is more affordable capture, it's can we just walk through a few scenarios of what activities we would hope to foster? Because if this was at the household level, I'm not even sure that providers exist who have this ready to go. Obviously, if it's ready mix cement, then maybe we can get carbon cure involved. But can we start do we have a vision for exactly what we hope is going to happen? And then we can work backwards to figure out what policy will make that activity that we want to happen.
I have a thought on that, but Sven, I didn't know at high level if you wanted to say if you had to sort of rank the most important objective of the policy. But I can certainly summarize what we've covered to date. And Sven at any time has to sometimes run and vote on things. He's in the Chamber of Deputies right now. So, but I think that what we've really uncovered is how do we help stimulate scale up? And that was what we learned from the feed-in tariff by any type of means necessary, but understanding really important technological and historic differences. And so I think this kind of strikes to the issue of how we structure the tariff is that it might be that there's a more prescriptive approach where we identify a certain types of use cases that are deemed to be ready and they could be priced, and we go with that. And that's all in the service of just figuring out ways to get CDR going in Luxembourg or with Luxembourg funding, right? The other thing that could be a benefit here, Eli, is that it allows the market to figure it out, right? You could say, we're going to put in a little part of the stack that's going to be for removals that presumes that that can be done on a small scale. We have no idea how that would happen given the logistical thing, and it might not ever happen. But it might create a strong enough signal where that does get figured out through the market because you've created these parameters that would value that. But in the meantime, things like local fuel production and the more doable things would also be able to occur. So you don't sort of shut the door on other innovations that might respond to a signal like this. So does that kind of answer your question in terms of what the
100%. I love keeping the signal open so that it fosters new ideas like methanol production in your backyard or whatever the heck it is. I love that. I just think there need to be a few things that we know will work to get started so that people use the policy. Like I think 45Q in its early days suffered from the fact that, and this is to your excellent point, that the policy needs to be able to be flexible and evolve, but like they made the policy and then nobody took them up on what was on the table.
Yep.
Because nobody could yet. But the point is also, it comes down to whether what you care, if you broke it up, there are suddenly all sorts of options to use the CO2, right? If you make a fizzy drink, clearly you can't claim storage, right? You might claim that otherwise it would have come from an ammonia plant, but in the US, that market is still 1,000 times larger than what air capture does right now.
Right.
So if you were to use that to leverage your way into it, and then you can demonstrate that you are competitive. If you can compete in that market, you are actually cheap enough to start getting regulatory things into place. So I remember when I was still in Los Alamos, people came and said, well, we want to do dry cleaning with CO2. There are also restaurants for soda fountains do actually buy CO2. Occasionally I run into a truck here driving CO2 around, right? So there are small markets. In Japan, lots of people use dry ice because they go to a supermarket, buy ice cream, and then they go on the subway. And so they actually get a baggie of dry ice. They give you a token at the cash register, you put it in, and you have a bag full of dry ice into which you can put your ice cream, right? And so then you go home, and by the time you get home, it's still frozen. So there are markets we tend not to think about, right? And if you don't think about, if you separate the storage part from this part, you suddenly may have applications you never thought about, and some entrepreneur might stumble into them, right? That's the beauty of keeping it open.
Great. I mean, you just nailed, I think, a lot of our working assumptions here. You know, Greg Nemeth, who I know you know, Klaus, you know, as a historian and scholar of innovation who's focused on solar, and a key part of the solar story that he mentions is that it was those early niches, however obscure and on the margins, that are what actually gave solar its resilience. That's what allowed it to sort of have a place to be in the world. And without that, it would have always just been something on a whiteboard. So the dry ice example in Japan with ice cream may seem silly, but that could be, in fact, the first, you know, one of 100 different links that might give, you know, a real world application for DAC that can be leveraged for larger applications.
So when we were working on it in the 2000 time frame, I went to a Safeway in Tucson because Alan Wright had its company in Tucson, and I looked what it would cost me to buy dry ice. It was $2,000 a ton.
Yeah, well, I like the diamond example. You know, what a good example is that, you know, ether. But go ahead, Eli, I look like you're about to say something.
Oh, I was just gonna, I sent it in the chat. I don't know if the YouTube video is capturing the chat, but yeah, I looked into the same thing for buying CO2 cartridges for SodaStream or for paintball guns, or for home brewing, or for home greenhouses for weed growing. All these people are paying $600-700 a ton. So I'm all on board that there are all kinds of niche applications for the CO2, but I'm still trying to understand like what kinds of things we're for fostering. And I come back to this biker's point that like, I actually think if we want to be entropically logical and yes, support DAC, but also be open to situations where the flue gas or the stream of CO2 is much higher concentration, then, you know, I think about, I've never visited Luxembourg, but I imagine there's a lot of brewing, there's a lot of fermentation processes, and, you know, I'm sure there's excellent beer there. So I would love if this were something that just immediately provided a price signal for anybody that's leaking out CO2 that's not at food grade maybe yet, but it's at 97, 98%. Doesn't take a lot to get that to 99.8%. And then you can sell it to the carbonated beverage person down the road. So I still feel like it would be useful to kind of catalog some real applications and know what they are and explore them a little bit. Like I've done a little bit of this in Oxford with a friend who wanted to start a brewing company. We did a little bit of back of the envelope, just costing to see, you know, how much would they be paying for CO2? How much CO2 would be coming off naturally? Could they re-inject that in to keep it more carbonated, et cetera? And it's like, it would be good to do a little bit of that just to kind of ground truth what the total addressable market might be, knowing that this policy in and of itself will increase that market, which we want to do.
But it'd be good if we started with some, is what you're saying. If we
have a sense of the cost. I just want, just to make it more tangible. That's all.
Yeah.
And I don't want to belabor that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I agree with you 100%. And Louis, I know you're on the policy end of things, but, you know, as a company that has a modular option, I'm sure you get a lot of interesting phone calls that are helping sort of discover what some of those potential applications could be. I didn't know if you had any ideas, again, understanding you're a policy guy, maybe not on the sales side, but anything you could think of early stage applications that might be ready to participate in something like this using your technology?
Yeah, obviously there is quite a few proposals that we receive. Some that you are really sitting there and being like, okay, so these are these kind of entrepreneurs that such a scheme would be looking for, just finding something that we couldn't have thought about by ourselves. But it's also to say that it's highly context specific. So the beverage market is one example. Prices vary almost 100% alike the distance to the next, I don't know, ammonia factory or whatever CO2 source is there next. So then it becomes a kind of scheme that is applicable only in the niche of the niche market, basically. Mm-hmm. So you have to rethink many kind of interfaces. So in parallel to the feed-in tariffs, I mean, that's the beauty of electricity. So you plug it in once and it doesn't matter anymore. And with CO2, this is not really the case. So it really depends what final product you get. And then I think it's the emphasis on what part of the process you try to highlight, where you want to improve most. And then I think it's a question also of accountability of things and how to come up with the accounting framework. I'm working on one such international project where there was a huge discussion only how do we define CDR? Is storage inherently in there or not? And so if we speak of a CDR policy now, and I think we, or the three of us, agree that it is a meaningful thing to fund both capture and storage and even transport in between. But then you'd have to adapt your definition of what the policy is for, because then it's not just CDR, or CDR might be the indirect effect only. And so it's quite hard, and it will result in a lot of details that need to be set at the regulatory level, and that they have to be considered correctly to allow basically anyone afterwards to just look at the rule book and say, okay, this is the way we do it, because this will reward us X, Y amounts of dollars, euros. Then I think the application is open. I think we should leave it up to entrepreneurs to come up with appliances, and what we need is really a rule book that simplifies things and says, okay, for capture you earn this. If you stack it with transport and storage, you get an extra. I mean, there is the precedent now in the 45Q also in the US, where you have the stackability. Basically, you get a less credit if it's used in EOR than if you store it for permanence. And so these kind of differences within value evaluation and monetization of tariffs is quite important.
Just to add on that, maybe, I think we already have something similar with the renewable energy fit, in the sense that we enable, we have different rates for different sizes of plants and also different users of the plants. So if you're a commercial entity, you get less than if you're a private citizen. And I think that stackability applies there as well. We just need to find a way to make it prescriptive and still be technologically agnostic.
Yeah, I think that's what you said, Lewis, is exactly the feed-in tariff. The magic of it was the simplicity. If it was clear for users, then those entrepreneurs are going to find what you just called the niches within the niches that there's no way any regulator was going to be able to pick, you know? And so I think that's the real key for us. And I think Sven laid it out very clearly in the beginning that if we're explicit that it's the scaling up market transformation is a priority, and we think that that will politically work, then there's no rule against us having the exact stack framework that you just mentioned. You know, removal, transportation, storage, each give you a different value. I love that idea. And I want to follow up around some of the stuff you mentioned in the UK. Do you guys have, I know we're at the hour, do you have a few more minutes since we started late? If not, I know you're busy people and we can hop off, but I did want to get
Unfortunately, I have at 11 o'clock, which is my hour.
Thank you, Klaus, so much. I'll follow up with you separately on the funding question, if that's okay. We'll have your thoughts on that.
Great to meet you, Klaus. It's an honor. Thanks for
Thanks so much for having this. It was a great discussion.
Great.
Thanks as well from my side.
And Eli and Lewis, do you guys have a few minutes?
Yeah, I can stay another 10.
Okay.
Right.
Eli, is that okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So one of the things we want to think about is just the funding part, which is obviously critically important. Feed-in tariff, it was controversial at different times. You know, it had a ratepayer fee. Hard to say if that would be passable today, given the sort of politics around energy bills. But for here, we've kind of scratched the surface. You know, Sven surfaced the idea of a general consumption tax that could be spread out, you know, among different sort of purchases that have carbon linked to it. I was floating the idea of something almost like New York City's local law 97, where you could base it on buildings and there's a carbon threshold. And if you go past that, there's a fine. We were just throwing spaghetti against the wall. Or you could do something very straightforward about you pick certain hard to abate industries and say, you're going to pay for it. This is the way you sort of comply. We're just getting to the surface of that. And I know you live and breathe this stuff, both of you guys. So I didn't know if you were king of Luxembourg or head of parliament, or Sven, what would you sort of propose as a way for us to think about a funding model for this that is politically palatable?
Luis, you go first and then I'll jump on from there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it depends where you start and end your calculation. So I think if we say, okay, the polluting industries are to be the funders of this project, then I think it's pretty certain to assume that most of the times costs will be forwarded to end consumers anyway. So even if you kind of come from the strictest angle and say, okay, polluting industries, you're the polluters, obviously you'll have to pay for it. I'm quite certain that costs will eventually be forwarded to end consumers in one way or the other. And nonetheless, I think this is one of, or basically when you apply taxes, where should they be applied? Then one of the ruling is you start upstream, because then actually it will follow through the whole value chain and have the biggest impact. So I think this is really a kind of meaningful and an economically efficient way to look at taxing. I think it's then becoming a hard and then disputed political discussions around who or what industry should be piloting such a scheme, for example. Or there is discussions around the carbon contracts for difference in the EU. And then also you have to define which sectors should pilot the scheme. And then these were hard political discussions that need to be kept in mind when arguing for industry paying for it.
Louis, one that just popped into my head that I want to share with Sven is that, you know, we're talking about Luxembourg here. It's a small country, but it has certain dominant industries, finance being one of them. It would be very interesting to look at investments that are made from Luxembourg in fossil fuels, that you tax that, and that then creates a disincentive for that. So boom, that's one good thing. And then you're also starting to pull together some money that you could actually potentially use to fund the premiums. Just saying that out loud. I don't know if that, what do you think of that, Eli or Louis?
I like the approach, and yeah, just full confirmation.
I love it because although Louis' point is absolutely correct, the user of the product always pays. When you put the penalty or the incentive or whatever it is on industry, I mean, not all consumers pay equally, and there are a certain subset of consumers who happen to be shareholders, right? The money can come out of the average person, or it can come out of the shareholder profit, and that's a lot trickier. But if one of the purposes of the policy, at least politically, is to put a squeeze on fossil carbon providers, then you can also well, then that gets a little bit far-fetched, because then you're basically creating a regulated asset base where you're saying, here's the maximum return that this particular industry is able to get. Profits above that go into this fund. And so you're basically saying there's a maximum amount of money that a shareholder can make on this kind of a thing. But generally, I like Louis' points about, and I'm in full agreement, having worked a lot on this policy that we call carbon takeback at Oxford that Miles Allen piloted, on focusing upstream on a smaller number of entities, focusing on the supply side end of the spectrum, and putting the responsibility there. So you say, in Luxembourg, anyone who is bringing fuel into Luxembourg, I imagine there's not much fuel extraction within Luxembourg. So we're just talking about stuff coming in. But the point when it crosses into Luxembourg's borders, you just do some stoichiometry and you say, you just brought this many tons of CO2 equivalent in to Luxembourg, and you have now incurred an obligation to put a certain amount of money into this fund, or to demonstrate that you've stored some amount of carbon on the back end, or whatever it is. So I think that's a really creative way. But I love the creativity, Chris, of taxing the financial industry and investments outside of Luxembourg that are made by people who are domiciled within Luxembourg. I have a feeling that might be politically unviable, because Luxembourg probably likes having the.
Yeah, Sven, hit it. Go ahead.
It might actually be more easily doable than having a border adjustment mechanism, for the simple reason that we are part of the single market, and the EU is already putting in place a border adjustment mechanism for goods outside of the European Union to implement a carbon tax, also for goods imported. So it will be very tricky to have one in the single market, if not impossible at all, because we can't have any hindrance of the free circulation of goods, money, and people. So for Luxembourg, it would be like if one of the US states would start to have their own border adjustment mechanism. I guess federal courts would have something to say about that.
Strangely, California seems to have done it.
Yeah.
And they've gotten away with it. And I think I see what you mean, Sven. I guess the idea would be, though, some fuels are extracted within the common market, right? In the UK, well, not no longer in the UK, but maybe Netherlands. So those fuels kind of get away somehow. And I imagine that every country, even if they're not stopping the truck at the border, but they do have some means of accounting for how much fuel enters. I don't know what kind of receipts they're using to prove that, but maybe it's the fuel suppliers have to track how much fuel they sell at the pump within a country. So I imagine there might be a way around it. But I guess what I'm curious about is, it might be easier legally, it sounds like, to put the tax on financial investors, but would that be easy politically? Because I don't know anything about Luxembourg, but I imagine one of Luxembourg's key competitive advantages is a very open and, relatively unburdened financial system and investment ability to domicile investment vehicles in Luxembourg.
There's the part of whether it's easy, and then the question of whether it's cheap. And people are already paying a premium to be domiciled in Luxembourg because they have access to the single market. Whereas Luxembourg is currently the only country in the world to have taxe d'abonnement, which is a wealth tax on financial vehicles. It's only 0.05%, but I could imagine having something of 0.06 and having like that 0.01 percentage point.
How much would that get us?
The 0.05 currently bring in about 1 billion euros a year. So add on top of that a fifth, you get 200 million a year to invest in DAC.
Sounds great.
So there is, we could increase like their tax burden by maybe even only 2 or 3%, and we get to a substantial amount of money to invest into in DAC. So the question is then, can we actually spend the money? And all the raising money is obviously an interesting exercise, but what we've seen in COVID times is that money can be found. The question is, can we actually spend it? And we currently have the problem that we have more money allocated to COVID fighting than we can actually spend on the market, because there's no need to spend that money. And so my main question is not can we raise it? I think there will be ways to raise it. The question then in the end will be, can we spend it, because the market will expand quickly enough to spend the money we raise.
That's the question of the external part. You know, we could put guardrails around on that. Last week, we got into some tricky territory about looking at like a low carbon fuel standard. You know, globally, you could do projects anywhere, but that might be a hard sell to the people of Luxembourg, where you could look at a community solar type of model that could happen outside of the country, but 50% of the subscribers have to be people from Luxembourg or something. So that allows you to sort of open up larger investment opportunity. But I know we're at time here, and I just want to say a couple of things. This was great. A few things popped into my head, so I'm going to be following up with you, and I'm dying to talk to Sven and team about it. But I want to give, obviously, we had Klaus, who's the godfather of DAC, one of the leading thinkers. It was great to get his input. But I want to give a huge shout out to Eli and his new group, Carbon Gap, which is an essential new organization that's been formed to really push carbon dioxide removal in Europe, that was just started at COP26. So incredibly excited to see that happen, and so happy that Eli is leading it. And then of course, Climeworks is making DAC a real thing before our very eyes. And I think we're seeing from the Orca project, we can now point to a thing that's not a rendering. And the way that you guys funded this through subscribers is a critically important, and that didn't involve the fossil fuel industry, is just, that is almost as historic as anything technical. So just want to commend Climeworks, a European company, for its leadership. And thanks, guys. This was fantastic. I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to keeping you posted on where this policy goes. But we hope this will be legislation that will be coming soon.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sven and Chris, for organizing. This is fantastic.
My pleasure. We'll talk soon. All right.
Nice
bye,
to
guys.
see you all.
See ya.
Bye-bye.